Hey guys, I'm Ethan, a New York City-based business growth coach, and I want to kind of do a little bit of a going back to basics corporate culture overview video for you, just to kind of lay the landscape as we head into the fourth quarter of 2025 on what's going on, the state of culture in American corporations. So right here is the annual research study results from the Society of Human Resource Management from 2024. And I thought there were some interesting findings as we head into 2026 that have been applicable for this past year. So, key findings, five key characteristics that are broadly shared values, attitudes, behaviors, and the norms of companies, globally, organizations create favorable cultures through five fundamental elements. And I see this in my consulting practice. These are all necessary criteria for building and maintaining an amazing place to work. So the first is honest and unbiased management. That means not only being transparent, but being completely above board in terms of your honesty, your approach to communication, not only with your employees, but your other stakeholders. So employees, clients, partners, vendors, suppliers, government agencies, the media, communities, all groups of stakeholders. So that's the first is honesty. The second is civil behavior. Operate with what we call probity or a moral compass. Exhibit the highest levels of ethical behavior in your day-to-day practice. And this is one of those where the people get direction from leadership. So leadership has to model on a day in, day out basis the most ethical behavior. If not, zero tolerance policy. Get rid of them. The third is meaningful work and opportunities. People, especially Gen Zs and millennials, want to be able to do work that they deem to be valuable. They want career and professional development opportunities, sometimes a little bit prematurely, as is the case with Gen Zs generally, as this generation. But also, when we say meaningful work, they want to be able to see the contributions that their work and their team and the organization contribute to making society a better place to live. Four, open communication. Communication in business is just like communication in any relationship. I've never, ever in my coaching practice come across an organization that got into trouble for communicating too much. It's the opposite. When communication is limited, when it's parsed out, divvied out on a need to know basis, when it's skewed based on political agenda, that's not going to fly. Communication needs to be in all directions at all times. And when things get chaotic, when things get problematic, that's when you need to step up, not down the pedal on your communication. And the fifth element that Sherm has identified as being global criteria for great places to work is empathy. So let me distinguish between empathy and sympathy, although I probably shouldn't have to. But sympathy is saying, oh, I understand the crisis you're going through as a working parent who has work-life balance, working remotely or hybrid, where you have to be primary caregiver for a parent and a child, a sandwich caregiver. No, sympathy is, oh, I can understand what that feels like. Empathy is, you know what? Let me try and put myself in your situation. I can see how coming back to the office 5 days a week would be problematic. I can't experience what you're going through, but I can try and put myself in that situation. And therefore, we will construct a meaningful work schedule around your work-life balance needs. So those are the five criteria that Sherm identified. Another key finding, which I think is fascinating because I've been saying this for 17 years, ever since I went out on my own in 2009. But check out number two. According to Sherm's 2024 Global Trends Survey of Workplace Culture, globally, a positive organizational culture generates financially beneficial outcomes by attracting and retaining top talent. Workers in a positive organizational culture are almost 4 times more likely to stay with their employer. And another corollary or ancillary benefit of creating a great place to work is amazing people who want to work there will also bring others in their social and their professional networks into the organization who are similarly amazing rock star employees. I'm going to put the link to all of these resources in the description below so you can go through them and really kind of read through the narrative, but I'm just touching on the salient points for purposes of this evening's primer. on cultural overview. So now I want to go to MIT management, Sloan School. So here's what experts at MIT and researchers are saying are the key building blocks of a healthy organizational culture, not only for now in a post-COVID, post-apocalyptic world, but going into the future where the world, the global business climate is transforming massively on a day in, day out basis. So we knew that the global pandemic, COVID-19, fundamentally turned upside down traditional working arrangements. We saw a massive increase in remote and hybrid work arrangements. That has expanded the ability to build geographically dispersed teams to communicate effectively through the digital environment, through the ether. We know that what we call abbreviated or truncated work weeks, 5 and 4, or working 3 12 hour, 3 days, 12, 14 hours, then 4 days off, including Saturday, Sunday. The only limitation is an organization's creativity in creating what we call abbreviated work and flex time. That's changed the fundamental dynamics of traditional work as we know it, and employees post-COVID will not go back. They won't. In this new era, leaders at every level of the organization struggle to be able to articulate an organizational culture that is built, predicated on these new norms. And they shouldn't be, because we've got decades of organizational behavior research that shows a fundamental shift from the traditional pyramid command control 20th century industrial manufacturing pyramid to flatter matrix organizations where we do away with unnecessary bureaucratic layers of administration, of bureaucracy, of middle management, and we connect senior and frontline staff together in self-managed teams. So here are some of the things that MIT Sloan researchers and experts are saying. Don't run from, don't push back against, but actually embrace what we call distributed leadership, or making employees be able to control their work, have more autonomy. So diffusing control. In this new 21st century flat organization, control is not to be hoarded by a select few at the top. Actually, control is to be distributed or democratized. And what I mean by that is in the whole Daniel Pink model, you go read his book Drive, he talks about pure autonomy, allowing your employees to have control over 4 aspects of their relationship with their employer: what they work on, when they work, where they work, and who they work with. Now, how can you trust your employees to have that kind of control? You need to fundamentally change your talent acquisition and recruiting to hire for rock star attributes rather than filling job descriptions. So that's a key consideration as you move to a more distributed leadership structure. In other words, leaders at places like Wegmans and Trader Joe's and Nucor Steel and Patagonia and Kind and World Central Kitchen and Chobani, they're flipping the structure, the organizational pyramid command control upside down, so that the few at the top, senior level, are now the leaders who solely exist to empower client-facing staff. It's an entirely new norm, said MIT Sloan lecturer Kate Isaacs. So that's one of the key considerations. Leadership's job is no longer to be the smartest in the room or the most powerful and have all the answers, she says, but rather to architect a new 21st century workplace game board where as many people as possible have the permission, the empowerment, the expectation of contributing what they are most capable of bringing to the table. So you basically have to unfurl their flag. You have to empower them to go into their portfolio of transferable skills and apply their experience, background, training, language proficiency, cultural diversity, volunteer work, community engagement, intrinsic motivation, personal drive, grit, lifelong learning. Those are the key behavioral attributes you seek to be able to flip the traditional pyramid command control pedagogy. And then we talk about a digital workforce. We talk about transforming a traditional workforce into one that's future ready now, fully embracing AI, virtual tools, Leaders need to, not should, but need to equip workers with the latest, greatest technological advancements to enable them to be accountable and give them the capabilities that they require to exploit all these tools, according to Christine Derry, who's an academic research fellow with the MIT Center for Information Systems Research. Powerful stuff. Let me just read one more aspect of this, and we'll move on. Companies need to take aim at their employees and empower them as problem solvers, critical thinkers, innovative, creative thinking. I mean, I've done programs with leadership teams in over 500 organizations over the last 17, 18 years, and it never ceases to amaze me that leaders are still trying to control problem solving and consolidating it, keeping it consolidated at the top. That can't happen. The rate of transformational change in the workplace, in the environment, in the landscape in which your organization competes, it's too chaotic. You can't consolidate. You have to distribute power. You have to give the people the tools, resources, autonomy they need to thrive, which means you need to recruit for a whole new set of talent dynamics. It's not something that you do just in theory. Companies that invest in the right experience for the right people and make sure they're ready to go right now into the future, they will always, not tend to, they will always outperform the competitors. Check this out. On average, employees empowered in such a way deliver 19% more growth in revenue than their competitors and generate 15% more profit. I know of what I speak. Sorry, I had to go get my book. I thought it was right here. I spent a decade researching over 200 countries and 7,000 organizations to find any attributes that all of the successfully most financially top performing companies in their respective industries, what attributes they share. And after a decade of research, which led to my book, The Compassionate Organization, I found that there was one universal fundamental truism. Amazing workplace cultures that are driven by people-first strategies. That's it. Regardless of country of incorporation, leadership structure, product, services, industry, sector, the one constant thread of all top-performing financially organizations is creating a great place to work that leverages a people-first strategy. Having said that, I want to go to Harvard Business Review. There's a really fascinating article dated August 25th. To change company culture, you should focus on systems, not communication. So when I've gone in and implemented change transformation culture project initiatives, it's this article. And I wish I had seen this years ago. I wish it was written years ago, but nonetheless, we don't need to talk about transformation. Leaders get too in their heads of talk about transformation. You need to develop the systems, processes, procedures that allow your people to transform. So a little bit about this article. Cultures talked about everywhere. You see it everywhere now. It's about time that we started getting to this kind of universal truism that culture eats strategy for breakfast, but it's one of the least consistently understood topics of change is culture transformation. So let me kind of read a little bit more. It's a strategic imperative, declare executives. They launch these value campaigns. They unveil these well-being wellness programs. They revise their vision and mission statements, which are marketing statements. They deliver impassioned talks about trust, purpose, triple bottom line, conscious capitalism, whatever the buzzword du jour is. But for all of this busy activity around culture, something isn't working. I want to read this to you. It's genius. In many organizations, we've seen that the louder leaders talk about culture, the more performative it feels, meaning it's almost obligatory. We're checking a box on the transformation checklist, especially when the actions of a relative few, the leadership team, or bad apples, don't align with the message being conveyed about the need and belief in transformation. Because culture is at the core of everything. It affects, it informs all of your decision making. It trickles down into all employee engagement, everything about your reputational brand as a great place to work or not great place to work, your willingness to tolerate or not tolerate risk. When culture change projects are poorly implemented, and I've seen this constantly in my practice, it's not just that you lose trust from your employees, that's a given. What actually happens is you set yourself back considerably. So, in that damaged landscape, it's better not to go down the path of culture transformation if you're not willing to be committed to it and want to learn throughout the process how to maximize the positive impact on all the aggregate stakeholders inside and outside your organization, but starting with your people first. Starting with your people first. So it's interesting because HBR in this kind of research driven article says the paradox is the starting point for our research. So to understand how culture plays out in real time, we conducted a cross-national study as part of the Elgar Encyclopedia of Leadership. Our aim was to explore how senior leaders define, express, and operationalize culture, and how those efforts are interpreted by the very people in the organization that the culture is intended to positively impact. Over 18 months, we engaged 164 senior leaders across North America, Asia, Europe, from organizations in the private, public, and the nonprofit domains. Leaders selected based on active involvement in shaping culture initiatives or overseeing major change. So they did a significant in-depth interviews and a number of other things, and a consistent pattern emerged. Here we go. Many leaders treat culture as communication, as a communication strategy. They believe that the change will happen if they're consistent in the messaging around it, in the articulation of this newly discovered sense of organizational purpose. We roll out these stated values. Maybe we have those black lacquer frames we put in the cafeteria, the tone of our internal communication to our people. But culture doesn't shift because the new narrative is created. That's not where the change actually happens. It shifts when an organization's systems of implementation change, when leaders take personal risks, when norms are just not these new value statements that are declared, but they're consistently exhibited. Leadership in action, day in, day out, by the totality of your leadership team exhibiting your desired ethical and moral behavior. So there were 4 key questions from this research, which I think is gangster, and I just want to present it. You can go in, see the research, see the tools that I put links to, and then dive deeper. But how do senior leaders define, and here's the key, measure culture impact? If you can't measure it, you can't determine its ultimate success. Culture has to be benchmarked with measurable metrics at the individual level, the team level, and the organization level. Next up, what are the disconnects between what leadership intends to change in culture and what people are experiencing? See, that's the great divide. Often in my consulting practice, leaders say, we are plan on, blah, blah, blah. And I hear them and I know that it's not going to succeed because I know that they haven't created a land bridge of connectivity, of connective tissue between what their intended desirable outcomes are and how you measure the positive impact on your people. And that's significant. Third, what behaviors are indicative of authentic intent to change and which eroded? So do as I say, not as I do. That creates toxic environment of distrust. So me modeling as a leader best behavior by treating people with empathy, respect, civility, trust, and loyalty, of me having a 0 layoff policy, of me actually spending every day in my relationship cultivating with my people, by being a servant master and seeing how I can deliver what they want, need, and desire, of me diving into the 5 universal humanistic needs that every individual possesses and delivering them for my people. You don't believe it's possible? Go watch any interview over the last 40 or 50 years with Yvon Chouinard, founder of Patagonia, up until recently, where he and his family gave away $3 billion in worth to combating climate change, because that's a value that the company was built on 50 plus years ago. So the fourth, what does it take to build a culture that lasts? Look at Disney. Look at what Walter Disney wanted to create with the Disney company. And look at the Disney just did now with ABC and Jimmy Kimmel in response to pressure from Trump and the head of the FCC and right-wing bloggers like Robbie Starbuck. So these are the 5 aspects that the HBR research talks about in this article by Benjamin Laker, Chidibreo Banyaya, Yassin Rofkanim, and Tomas Corny and Marcelo Mariani. And I'll put the link to this in the description below. So here's something that I found that's interesting, and it's particularly insightful and timely because I've been doing a lot of videos on this. So from the Pew Research Center, excuse me, Americans are divided on whether companies should make statements about political and social issues. So we talk about Gaza, we talk about the war in Ukraine, we talk about what's going on in other nation states where there is this global trend from democracy to dictatorship. We talk about things like blood diamonds and child warriors and just all this abject insanity. And the notion of, should you talk about it? Well, I'm of the belief and ideology, and I coach my leaders in the organizations I'm lucky enough to work with to be constantly conscious of the values our organization stands for, such as the ethical sourcing of materials, things like diamonds, things like coffee, things like cotton, things as simple as tea, and companies like Honest Tea versus Starbucks. So I am always an advocate for organizations who are verbal in their defense of the ethical construct that their organization's values are built upon or predicated upon. Because at the end of the day, whether you're an individual, whether you are a leadership team and or an organization, you only have your reputation. And now more than ever, Gen Zs not want, demand, millennials demand that the organizations they work for reflect their own values and exhibit their desirable values in terms of how your organization acts. And the sign of ethical behavior is how you act when you don't think you're being watched. So Americans divided on whether companies should make statements about political and social issues. So Catherine Cheng and Juliana Horowitz, I want to read this. Americans are still divided on the importance of companies and organizations who are making public statements on political and social issues. Half of US adults say these types of company statements are very or somewhat important. The other half say they're not too or not at all important, according to Pew Research Center survey conducted this past February. And this article was from August. This is similar to what we found in 2020, when 52% of survey respondents said these kinds of public and social cause statements are important. 48% said they're not important. And that was after the George Floyd murder by a white police officer in Minneapolis. So the statistics haven't shifted that much. But interestingly enough, when you look at the percent composition of the survey, whites said 50%, 57% not important, versus 63% of blacks who said very important, speaking out, and Hispanic 63%, Asian 66%. So Republicans, or those leaning Republicans, at 66% not important, versus Democrats or Democrat leanings at 66%. Very important or somewhat important. So you can see that the party lines by ethnicity and political affiliation are in alignment. You can kind of see how that presents itself in the American political system. and the discourse going on right now. So again, check out this Pew Research because it's fascinating. So views of diversity, equity, inclusion have become slightly more negative. And I have been doing videos for the last, oh goodness, last few years, but certainly since January of 2025, on corporations who I argue have completely lost their minds and lost touch with what the largest segments of their employee bases and their consumer bases want, millennials and Gen Zs, by moving away from, doing away with their diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives and programs in response to pressure exerted from the right Heritage Foundation, right-wing bloggers, the Trump 2.0 administration. You look at corporations who are everywhere, pulling away from their DE&I, Harley Davidson, John Deere, Boeing, Target, Meta, McDonald's, Walmart. The list goes on and on and on, not realizing that that's a self-inflicted damage. That's a death knell when you look at the composition of our workforce that has been shifting to fewer Caucasian, and the two fastest growing demographics every census are Latinos and Asians. To the point where by 2050, the percent of white America will be less than 50% for the first time in our 225-year history. So this is important. This is important. And yet, there's still this inner turmoil going on in business and industry. So let's talk about American workers' opinions on the role of DE&I efforts in the workplace. They've become more negative in the last year, according to the Pew Research Center, which I alluded to just previously. But of course, it's going to skew that way when you think about the negative press coverage, the negative focus that the Trump administration is giving. So going back to February of 23, workers are now somewhat more likely to say that focusing on DE&I at work is mainly a bad. They're more likely to say that their company, their organization pays too much attention on increasing DE&I. So in a separate survey, we, Pew Research, asked Americans overall, regardless of their own employment status, about their views on the impact of DE&I practices. Here's the rub. More Americans say that DE&I practices help rather than hurt Black, Hispanic, and Asian men and women, as well as white women. In turn, far more Americans say DE&I hurts white men than says it helps them, 36 versus 41%. And that's the interesting tug of war that's going on. White male America has been feeling for a while that they're being attacked, that their American privileges are being taken away from them, subsumed. We saw this in 2016 with the Tiki marchers in Virginia, and there are some fine people on the Ku Klux Klan, on the Proud Boys side, and on the other side, from Trump's mouth to the rioters on January 6th's ears and marching orders. So it's fascinating. It's fascinating that there's this internal conversation or dynamic going on in organizations across America about the true meaning of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so no wonder that corporations are struggling with the seemingly constant, at odds, philosophical debate about the value of meaningful culture and what culture actually means. And this is why going to Axios, who is one of the definitive sources of annual survey research into corporate America on the feelings, the belief, the ideology of workers. Companies that kept their DE&I commitments, according to Axios Harris's research of 2025, saw higher reputation scores that are in organizations. So organizations had a higher positive reputations when they kept their DE&I. And by the way, there's a direct corollary with these companies being some of the top financial performing companies in the world. Go figure. So listen to this. Listen to this. The change in Axios Harris Poll 100 reputation scores among the companies that maintain their DE&I commitments. Listen to this Hall of Fame of corporations. Okay? those that actually increased their investment in their D&I initiatives, and this from 2024 to 2025 of 16,000 American adults who were surveyed. Patagonia, they are to me the Rolls Royce of organizational culture. Ask me why. Microsoft, Costco, Apple. Interestingly enough, JP Morgan, Chase and Coca-Cola and Procter and Gamble and Kroger and Netflix and who's who? A cavalcade of the financial top performing companies, not just in the US, but globally. And you can see the delta, the trend line up or into the positive domain of increased investment in D&I. Companies that maintain commitments to their diversity, equity, and inclusion saw reputation scores rise in this year's Axios Harris Poll 100 reputation rankings. And why does this matter even? Unclear corporate values or a lack of conviction, most recently seen through mass DE&I walkbacks, can hurt, damage, hinder your reputation, and thus affect your financial performance. Across 100 companies, corporate reputation declined by an average of 2.3 points in 2025. All right, so in the aggregate, we're seeing that scale back. I mentioned that. I've done articles on it ad nauseum. However, here's the piece of gold to be discovered. Those companies that held firm on their DE&I commitments saw scores rise by an average of 1.5%. Big picture, takeaway, several companies that scaled back their DE&I benchmarking goals amid concerns of legal exposure after Trump administration calls to dismantle DE&I with corporate America. Yes, but according to the Pew Research study, a slim majority of US workers say increasing DE&I at work is basically a good thing. Reputation scores are built on trust, culture, ethics, citizenhood, Jesus Christ, all the stuff that's meaningful. I'm going to do a subsequent video on reputable organizations who are responsible for coming up with culture scores. So Irrational Capital, Great Place to Work, Ethisphere, all of those places that do culture objective metric measurement. There's a straight line path between the most ethical organizations and those that consistently financially outperform their competitors. Patagonia and Costco rank within the top 3 in character, culture, and citizenship. Of course they did. Remember Costco's board refusing to entertain in a recent board meeting the threat from certain board members to do away with their DE&I initiatives? Costco's board said, no, we're not even going to put a vote on that. Damn. Okay. Microsoft, which saw one of the largest score increases last year, ranked excellent. Thank you, Satya Narayan. Excellent across the categories of trust, culture, and vision, amongst others. Meanwhile, most companies saw a decline in reputation in the past year. Also rolled back or revised their D&I policies. Jesus, look at Harley Davidson. I did a whole lengthy video on Harley Davidson on my YouTube channel. They spent a decade and billions of dollars completely modifying their product line to appeal to a new generation of younger, more ethnically diverse millennial and Gen Z consumers, and then literally were one of the most draconian pullback of DE&I, which literally whiplash confusion to their employees and the ultimate consumers they've been targeting for the better part of a decade. Okay. So I want to kind of touch on this, the Axios 2025 Harris Poll Reputation Rankings. So you look at the top performers. I mentioned them. I mentioned them already, but you look at their aggregate score in 2025 and the prior 6 years leading up. So you have Trader Joe's up in reputation, Patagonia up over the last 6 years, Microsoft, Toyota, Costco, Samsung, Arizona Beverage Company. You can kind of see that they either maintain their reputation scores or went up. It's pretty much a straight line path. So that's kind of the shout out. You can kind of see, you can see what's happening. John Deere remained the same, even though they did away with their DE&I initiatives. But places like Aldi and Walgreens, I mean, across the industry sector, relative size of firm, it doesn't matter. The reputations of some of these firms go up when they improve their culture. Reputation goes down when they do things that are detrimental to their culture. And the last is the conference board. This to me is really fascinating because they picked up on the Axios Harris research and they talk about how US companies' reputations have fared amongst all of